Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a room built from stone and shadow. The air is cold, and the only light comes from flickering torches that throw long, trembling shapes across the walls. Chains hang from the rafters. The smell of old wood and iron sits heavy in the air. In the center of that room rests a large wooden frame. Simple at first glance, brutal in purpose. This was the rack, an instrument designed not merely to punish, but to unmake a human body and break a human will. The rack looks deceptively ordinary. Two long beams of wood, a roller at one end, a crank and rope system. But the device's design answered a single, terrible purpose: to stretch. The condemned would be bound, wrists lashed to one end, ankles fixed to the other. At first, a slow, measured turn of the crank would pull the ropes taut. The body would stretch just enough to panic the prisoner. Then the turning continued. A little more, a little more. Joints loosened, ligaments strained. The pain did not come as a single violent moment. It arrived as an unrelenting progression, a crescendo of suffering that demanded every small breath be paid with dread. Why did people create such a device? The answer lies in the dual language of power and spectacle. In pre-modern societies, authority required not only punishment, but demonstration. To punish privately risked the lesson being overlooked. To punish publicly ensured the consequence would lodge in the memory of a community. The rack was theater and law at once. It was meant to be visible. It was meant to be instructive. If images teach faster than laws, then a body stretched on a wooden frame taught harder than any sermon. Under the rack, the body betrayed itself in the most intimate mechanical ways. Muscles tightened and trembled, tendons yawned under the pressure, and cartilage was forced to yield. Shoulders slipped from their sockets. Hips dislocated. Joints clicked and cracked. Some victims emitted screams. Others lapsed into stunned silence as the nervous system itself was overwhelmed. And yet, the process could be extended. The torturer, or the authority behind them, controlled the rhythm of agony with clinical calm. A confession could arrive as a desperate bargaining chip. The human mind, in the face of relentless pain, will often prefer any story that stops the turning of the handle. Across Europe, the rack was a common instrument in courts and inquisitions. The Tower of London reported its use. The Spanish Inquisition employed variants. Royal courts, municipal judges, ecclesiastical tribunals all had reasons to extract confessions, to humiliate enemies, to reinforce obedience. In times of war or political instability, the rack became a tool for rooting out dissent, real or imagined. Accusations of treason, witchcraft, heresy, or spying could lead a person to this wooden frame. Whether the accused was guilty rarely mattered. The performance of power did. There were practical, chilling consequences beyond the immediate pain. Many who survived the rack never truly recovered. The injuries were long-lasting: chronic joint pain, permanent dislocation, torn ligaments, and ruptured muscles that left a person crippled for life. Some victims developed infections at sites of injury. Without modern antiseptics, such conditions could fester into fatal complications. In extreme reported cases across centuries, the body was so thoroughly destroyed that recovery was impossible. The rack's legacy on a community was therefore twofold. It punished the individual, and it projected a lasting image of the cost of defiance. History is not simply a list of devices. Behind instruments like the rack sits a complex web of social logic. Torture was justified by certain legal and moral frameworks. In the medieval and early modern mind, extracting truth could be understood as a necessary, if regrettable, part of justice. A confession, especially one publicly given after torture, carried weight. And herein lies a tragic twist. Confessions obtained under duress often produced not clarity, but narratives. Stories that served the prosecutor, that validated prior assumptions, and that could be used to justify harsher measures. The rack, in other words, fed a cycle. Pain produced confession. Confession produced legitimacy. Legitimacy produced further uses of pain. We must also consider the human agents behind the mechanism. Executioners, torturers, and clerks were people working within a system. Some were zealots, convinced of their moral duty. Others were functionaries, acting on orders. A few might have taken perverse satisfaction in the spectacle. But the institution was larger than individual cruelty. Laws, cultural beliefs, economic pressures, and political instability all converged to create climates in which torture was tolerated, even expected. That is what makes the rack so chilling. It was not an anomaly. It was woven into institutions. Let's turn to stories, because history often survives in narrative. Chroniclers and court records sometimes reported confessions obtained on the rack, naming alleged conspirators or confessing to crimes. Literary accounts amplified the horror, and political pamphlets used testimonies as propaganda. Over time, the rack entered both legal manuals and popular imagination. For every documented case, there were whispers and rumors. Tales of innocent men stretched until their bones popped, of women pressed to admit crimes they had not committed, of political rivals broken to secure the crown. The rack-is image worked like a brand. It guaranteed that the price of opposition would be remembered. Yet even in its zenith, the rack was not unchallenged. From the Renaissance onward, philosophical and legal critiques began to erode the acceptance of torture. Thinkers questioned the morality of inflicting pain to obtain truth. Empirical inquiry began to demand evidence over confession. New standards of justice, however imperfect, emerged. By the 19th century, many European legal systems curtailed or abolished judicial torture. The rack, as a practical tool of the court, declined. But its symbolic afterlife persisted. Literature, art, and later cinema kept its image alive as shorthand for institutional cruelty. What does the rack tell us about ourselves now? For one thing, it reminds us that systems of power can normalize violence if sufficient cultural and institutional frameworks support it. It shows that legality does not guarantee justice. A procedure can be lawful and still be morally wrong. And crucially, it warns how easy it is to mistake compliance for truth. When a system incentivizes confession under pain, what is extracted is less likely to be reliable testimony and more likely a reflection of desperation. There is also a human dimension that must not be lost: the victims. Behind every historical description is a person who suffered. Names are sometimes recorded in archives. A traitor accused of theft, a noble accused of betrayal, a peasant ensnared in a rumor, a heretic named in zeal. Many of these lives ended broken. Remembering them is a vital part of studying this history, honoring those who endured, and learning from the systems that made such endurance necessary. Finally, the rack stands as a cautionary emblem for any society. It is a reminder of how law, spectacle, and power can combine to produce cruelty. It also speaks to resilience. Human beings have endured absurd and terrible conditions throughout history, sometimes surviving with dignity intact, sometimes not. Our task as observers and as inheritors of these stories is to keep the memory alive in a way that prevents repetition. So when you picture that wooden frame, the cold stone chamber, the turning of the crank, remember that the rack was not merely a machine. It was a mirror held up to societies that chose fear as governance. It was a testimony to how easily justice can be corrupted when spectacle outweighs evidence, when power seeks demonstration rather than truth. And it is, in the end, a lesson. The past is full of horrors, not so that we revel in them, but so that we refuse them for the future. History isn't comfortable. It isn't tidy. It asks us to remember the worst parts of ourselves so that we can be better than they were. The rack was one of those worst parts. Let it be a warning, not an inheritance.